What would you do if the homeless pregnant woman your family had taken in suddenly became more than a guest, more than a burden, and more than a secret, just as the father from your painful past arrived at your gate, carrying money, memory, and the power to change all three of your lives? That afternoon began like any other on the farm, with sunlight lying softly across the vegetable beds and the ordinary sounds of labor filling the quiet. But under that calm surface, three different hearts were carrying three different hungers. Ly wanted a place where she and her unborn child could finally stop running. Tu Tien wanted to believe that kindness, once offered, could truly save someone. And Jack, though worn down by work and responsibility, wanted to keep proving that even in hardship, a family could still choose compassion over fear. Then fate moved faster than any of them expected. A father figure from Tu Tien's old life appeared with a large sum of support money in his hands. A fragile plan suddenly became possible. A small hut could be built, a future could be offered, and before the sun went down, the woman who had arrived with silence in her eyes would finally tell the truth about the child she had once been forced to abandon, the marriage that had broken her, and the cruelty that had taught her to expect rejection instead of mercy. By nightfall, a vegetable garden would become the place where one woman's suffering was finally witnessed, another woman's compassion was tested into action, and a man who could have chosen distance instead chose responsibility. It was not a story about rescue in one dramatic gesture. It was a story about how real salvation often begins in a field, in a kitchen, in a shared meal, and in the quiet decision to tell someone, "You can stay." The afternoon sun had turned warm and honey-colored by the time Tu Tien bent low over the vegetable beds. The farm looked peaceful from a distance. Rows of greens stretched neatly through the soft soil. The leaves shone with health. A light breeze moved through the garden and carried the scent of earth, water, and growing things. But peace on that land had never meant ease. Every bed had been watered by effort. Every row had been saved from ruin more than once. Tu Tien knew that better than anyone. Beside her, Ly was trying to work. Her movements were slower, less certain. One hand pulled weeds. The other often drifted unconsciously to her belly, as if checking that the life inside her was still safe. She was no longer the frightened woman Mrs. Ly had once dragged out of the rain, nor the desperate, broken figure who had crossed into the family's life carrying shame and chaos behind her. But she was not well yet either. Her body still carried exhaustion, and her face still held the shadow of someone who had spent too long expecting every kindness to end in punishment. Tu Tien noticed everything. That was the kind of woman she had become. She could work and watch at the same time. She could smile and still understand pain in someone else's silence. So, as she loosened soil around the roots and flicked tiny insects from the leaves, she began speaking in the easy, practical tone that makes wounded people feel less like a burden. She told Ly about the market, not in grand stories, but in the small details that make a life feel livable. Which vendors were talkative, which women always bargained too hard, which corner had the best shade in the morning, which buyer returned every week for fresh greens. She even smiled and said that when Ly's belly grew bigger, she would take her to town and buy looser clothes, because the ones she had now were already beginning to cling too tightly around her waist. Ly looked up at that. The expression in her eyes was almost painful to witness, not because it was sad, but because hope had entered it so timidly, as if afraid it might be beaten back out again. She did not answer at once. Instead, she bent to pull one more weed, buying herself a few seconds to hide the emotion rising through her throat. Tu Tien pretended not to notice that pause. That, too, was kindness. The two women continued side by side, sharing the work in small movements and shared silences. The garden, which had seen hardship, hunger, rebuilding, and compromise, now held something new, the beginning of trust between women who had both been wounded by life in different ways. Tu Tien could already sense that Lay's loneliness ran deeper than she had yet confessed. And once she sensed it, something inside her settled into decision. Whatever had happened before, whatever storms Lay had walked through to reach this place, Tu Tien no longer wanted her merely sheltered, she wanted her protected. Then the sound of footsteps came from the path. Jack had returned. He looked tired first, then relieved. His shirt clung slightly at the back with sweat from the day. Work had clearly taken its share from him, as it always did now. Yet the moment he saw the two women together in the garden, his wife bent over the greens, the pregnant guest trying sincerely to help, his face changed. A small, genuine brightness entered it. It was not joy exactly. It was something quieter and more moving. Hope, the kind that appears when life, without warning, briefly resembles what a man had once wanted it to be. He crossed toward them carrying a metal pitcher and 2 glasses. "Enough," he said gently to Lay first. "You should sit down and rest." There was no authority in the sentence, only care. He poured water for both women and handed the first glass not to his wife, but to Lay. That choice mattered. It told her, without forcing any dramatic speech upon her, that she was being seen not as a problem temporarily tolerated, but as a fragile life worth watching over. Then he turned to Tu Tien. Their eyes met only briefly, but in that briefness there was a whole private conversation. He was tired. She knew. He was worried. She knew that too. But he had come home and found kindness growing instead of conflict. For one small moment, that was enough. He asked Lay how she felt. He reminded her gently that whatever task she took on, she had to remember she was carrying a child. Again, it was simple. Again, it was more powerful because it was simple. Tu Tien watched him and felt that familiar gratitude rise in her chest, the gratitude of a woman who sees that the man she loves remains gentle, even while pressure keeps trying to harden him. For a few breaths, the farm felt like a home large enough for all 3 of them. Then the gate opened. The timing was so abrupt that all 3 turned at once. A man stood there carrying a cloth bag in both hands. Age had bent him slightly but not broken him. His face bore the roughness of someone who had known long labor, shame, and late regret. Tu Tien recognized him first, and the recognition hit her with enough force to lift her halfway upright before she even spoke. It was her former father-in-law. He had come unexpectedly, carrying not only his presence but something heavier. His eyes found Tu Tien first, and whatever embarrassment might once have existed between them fell away almost immediately. He had always regarded her with more tenderness than judgment. Even when life had made her place in his family painful and uncertain, he had not stopped seeing her as a daughter in spirit. He greeted Jack with careful respect, then looked at Tu Tien again. "I came because I heard things have been difficult," he said. The words were simple, but what followed stunned the whole yard into silence. He opened the cloth bag and placed inside it a thick bundle of money. Not a few emergency notes, not a token gift, a large sum, enough to alter immediate decisions, enough to turn imagined help into practical possibility. Tu Tien instinctively stepped back. Jack's brows pulled together at once. He was not a man who accepted money lightly, especially from people whose lives had already known hardship. But the older man lifted a hand, stopping both protest and politeness. He said he had no children who looked after him the way Tu Tien once had when his own life was falling apart. He said there are debts in this world that cannot be repaid through law or blood, only through conscience. He said he wanted to help because he could not bear watching decent people drown while he stood on dry ground pretending not to see it. The yard changed around those words. Tu Tien's eyes filled first. Jack remained silent longer. Because that is what proud men do when gratitude arrives in a form too direct to hide from. Even Lay, standing slightly apart, understood that she was witnessing something intimate. One of those rare moments when generosity enters not from wealth, but from remembered humanity. Jack tried once to refuse. The older man refused the refusal more firmly. It became clear this was not charity meant to humiliate. It was respect translated into action. In the end, they accepted. Not easily, not greedily, but with the solemnity the gift deserved. When the older man finally sat for water and spoke a little longer, the conversation moved naturally into Ly's situation. He listened, frowned, and then nodded in the way of an older villager who understands that when someone is carrying a baby and nowhere else exists, morality becomes less theoretical. He did not ask too many questions. He only said that women in such conditions need shelter first, judgment later. By the time he left, something had already begun shifting inside Jack and Tu Tien. They did not discuss it in front of him. They waited until the gate closed behind his retreating figure and the yard fell still again. Then they sat together on the low porch. The money lay between them on the woven mat, not as temptation, but as possibility. Jack exhaled slowly. There were many places the money could go. Debt, tools, daily expenses, protection against the next emergency. Life had taught them how quickly any sum can shrink under pressure. But Tu Tien's mind had already moved elsewhere. She looked toward the far edge of the land, toward a quiet corner near the vegetable beds where old bamboo poles and roof material were stacked. "We should build her a small hut," she said. Jack turned to her. She continued, voice growing steadier as she spoke. "Not a luxurious room, not a burden on the main house, just a warm, simple hut. A place where Ly could sleep with dignity, where she could have privacy, where the child she carried would not feel like a tolerated accident in someone else's life." Jack listened without interrupting. Then Tu Tien said the second part. They could also give Ly real work. Not exhausting work, meaningful work. She could care for the vegetable garden. Something steady and close to home. Something that would allow her to stand again without being crushed. The task would not be a favor disguised as pity. It would be responsibility, belonging, and income. That was the true brilliance of the idea. Jack understood it instantly. Tu Tien was not asking to save Ly by keeping her dependent. She was asking to help her live. And because of that, he agreed almost immediately. He said yes with the seriousness of a man who knew he was making more than a practical decision. He was helping define what kind of house theirs would be. The kind that locks its gates after being hurt. Or the kind that, though wiser now, still dares to make room for another life. When he said yes, relief moved visibly through Tu Tien's body. They were not merely housing a tragedy anymore. They were building a beginning. Later, when Jack went inside to wash and make a few calls, the farm held only the two women again. The light had softened by then. Shadows lengthened through the vegetable rows. Birds moved noisily in the trees, preparing for evening. Tu Tien sat down beside Ly on the low wooden bench near the water jars and asked gently, "Tell me the truth. What happened to you?" Ly did not answer immediately. Her fingers tightened over the edge of the bench. Her eyes remained fixed somewhere far past the garden, as if the story was not in front of her but still walking toward her from a much darker road. Tu Tien did not press. She waited. At last, Ly spoke. She said she had been married at 16. The sentence landed with quiet violence. There are facts that already contain their own accusation. That was one of them. She had been too young to understand marriage, too young to understand childbirth, too young to understand what kind of family she had entered, but by the time she realized, she was already trapped inside it. Her husband had not been a monster in the dramatic sense at first. He had simply been weak, and weakness in a man becomes cruelty very quickly when it is fed by a bitter mother. When Ly became pregnant, the whole family behaved as if a son had already been delivered. Expectations were wrapped around her belly before the child had even been born. Every meal, every prayer, every conversation turned toward one desire, a boy, but the child had been a girl. And that, in the house she entered, had been treated not as birth, but as failure. Ly's voice changed when she reached that part of the story. It no longer sounded like narration. It sounded like reliving. She described the room, the blood, the weakness after labor, the way no one celebrated, the way her mother-in-law looked at the baby and then at her with disgust, so complete it seemed to erase the fact that both had nearly died bringing life into the world. She described the first insult, then the second, then the sentence that ended her place in that family. "If you can't give us a son, get out." Tu Tien closed her eyes for 1 second. Even before the next part came, she already knew it would be worse. Ly started crying fully then. Not neatly, not beautifully. Her body folded inward as though grief had been waiting for permission and finally received it. She told Tu Tien how they had cursed her, shoved her toward the door, called her useless, called the newborn a burden, called both of them unlucky. Her husband had not defended her. That was the part that seemed to wound her most even now. He stood there, watching, choosing silence over protection. By the time she was finished, Tu Tien was crying too. Not loudly, but enough that when she reached for Ly, it was no longer out of sympathy alone. It was recognition. Women like them did not need all details explained. The emotional shape of abandonment was already familiar. She pulled Ly into her arms and held her. For a while, there was only sobbing, breath, and the last light sliding over the garden as if evening itself had paused to witness the truth. Then, while Ly was still trembling against her shoulder, Tu Tien told her about the hut, about the garden work, about the decision she and Jack had made. Ly drew back as if she had misheard. Her eyes moved across Tu Tien's face, searching for signs of kindness too generous to trust. But Tu Tien only repeated it more simply. They would build her a small hut, and if she wanted it, the garden would be hers to care for. No one would drive her away. No one would curse her child for being born. She could stay. The transformation in Ly's face was almost unbearable to watch. Shock first, then disbelief, then a happiness so wounded by previous disappointment that it came out as tears before it became a smile. She covered her mouth with both hands and cried harder than before, but this time the crying did not sound like collapse. It sounded like release. She thanked Tu Tien again and again until words became useless. Evening deepened. The air cooled. Somewhere inside the house, a pot lid clinked. Tu Tien stood later in the kitchen preparing dinner with a heart that felt strangely lighter than it had that morning. Outside, the vegetable garden darkened gently under the settling dusk, and the place where the hut would stand no longer looked empty. It looked like a promise, and perhaps that was the true meaning of that day. Not that suffering had vanished, not that money had solved everything, not that life had suddenly become fair, but that one woman's compassion had become action, one man's agreement had turned kindness into structure, and one broken life had finally heard the words it needed most. Stay, work, rest, begin again. Under the last gold of the sunset, the garden seemed to hold that promise in its leaves. A new beginning had not arrived with thunder. It had arrived quietly through money freely given, through a husband who chose responsibility, through a woman who listened until another woman's pain could breathe, and through the small, radical decision to make room for hope before certainty ever came.